Hello everybody and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to come along. We're at 6 p.m. now, so I'll formally commence this session. Welcome to the Bayside information session on the Victorian Government's Activity Centres program. We're pleased to have so many of you along. We've got roughly 80 people on the line tonight and we're expecting a few more. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners across the lands on which we're meeting. Specifically the lands that we're here to speak about today, the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And I'd like to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander community members who might be joining us this evening. The purpose of this session is to share information about the state government activity centres, including local information that might help you have a stay and keep informed. And it's also an opportunity for you to ask questions. It's a state government project, but given the level of local interest, Bayside City Council wants to make sure that you have information and that you can have a say. So Bayside's brought together a panel of expert speakers to help explain and answer questions on the topic. I'm not one of those experts, but I will be guiding this session. My name's Kaz Treby. I'm a facilitator from Kapir Consulting Group, and my responsibility tonight is to support this session to run to time and to have your questions answered. So I'll introduce our panellists shortly, but I'll give you a bit of an overview of our agenda for this evening in terms of what we'll be going through. So we'll be hearing from Bayside City Council about the Activity Centre program and what it means locally. Then we'll have an introduction from each of our panellists, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask your questions from the audience, and we'll put those to our panellists. We'll close out and finish by 7:30, and we'll give you some information about how you can have a say in the state government process. So that's what we're tracking to, and I'll be the person who's kind of keeping us on track and to time. But before we hand over to Kelly for our presentation, I've got a little bit of housekeeping. So this session will be recorded. So if you have family or friends or colleagues who are interested, you could send them a link after the session. Or if there's a complex topic that you wish to revisit, or if there's a question that you thought, I really want to kind of dig into that, you could do so online afterwards and watch the session back. We have a lot of people online planning to join this evening, so it'll be run as a webinar style, and that means you don't have to worry about being on or off mute or having your camera on or off. They'll automatically be switched off for you. Any technical difficulties, please email the team. That's planningstrategy@bayside.vic.gov.au. So if you're having difficulty working out how to ask a question, please do email that through to the team, and they're here to help you. They'll be working hard in the background, making sure questions come through. So the way that we're going to take questions tonight is through using Menti, which some of you might have used before. There'll be a QR code that comes up on the screen shortly, and you'll be shown that QR code again when we go through to the panel time. So don't worry if you kind of, if you need reminding to get that up on the screen, we'll send you a URL code and link that to you. You can send your questions through during the presentation. You know, sometimes you might kind of not want to hold that until the end, but you might also want to make note of it in case it's answered during the presentations, and then you kind of want to ask your questions there. If we run out of time for all questions, Bayside will follow up after the session with a written response for those that weren't covered, and we might kind of group some questions together if we're getting lots of similar ideas or themes, so you might not hear yours asked word for word. We've got some really fantastic and knowledgeable people in the virtual room this evening, so please ensure that your comments, questions and feedback is in keeping with the behaviour that we'd expect, and keep it nice and respectful for our team. And a bit of a reminder that this is a state government project, so the team here are here to share what they know, but some questions we might need to take on notice if they're not able to be answered by the particular group of people that we have today. So you can now see on your screen a QR code. I'd encourage you to get out your mobile phone and head to the camera, and you can point that to your screen, and you should have a little option come up so that you can click through to ask questions. If you don't have a mobile phone, you're working from a laptop, you can drop the URL, the Menti URL in there, and there's an access code there for you. As I said, this won't be the last time that you see that QR code, but do send your questions through to the team, and when we're at the panel section, they'll come through to me and I can put them to our panellists. We will hear from our panel speakers shortly, and in a minute they will formally introduce themselves when we kick it off. But briefly, so you know who's in the room, we're joined today by Nicola Smith, who's the founding director of Niche Planning, which is a specialised planning and urban design consultancy that operates all across Australia. We've got Mike Scott, who co-founded the consultancy Planisphere. He's also the convener of Charter 29, and he's in his career specialised in activity centre planning. Matthew Crisps is Bayside's own CEO and was the Director of City Planning and Amenity here. He's got over 25 years experience in land use planning and local government. And Michael Buxton, who's an Emeritus Professor at RMIT University, former head of RMIT Planning and Environment program. So welcome to our panel and thanks so much for joining us and coming along to share your knowledge and insights this evening. We're also joined by Kelly Archibald from Bayside City Council. Kelly's the Director of City Planning and Amenity, and she's experienced in Metro, Melbourne and Greenfield development, local planning across many areas. This evening, Kelly will give a presentation about the Activity Centre program, and I'll hand over to you now, Kelly.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My role tonight is to provide an overview of the State Government Activity Centres program and highlight some important considerations for the Bayside community to consider. The information we'll share tonight is based on the information that's been made available to us from the State Government. I acknowledge there'll be lots of questions on why boundaries have been drawn the way they have and the implications of what's been proposed. While we acknowledge these are important questions, Bayside doesn't have all the answers. What we're trying to achieve here tonight is to connect the Bayside community with the information that's been made available from the State Government and inform the community on matters that can be raised in submissions, inform you on how to make a submission and where to get further information from. To understand how we've got here, it's probably important to understand the journey that we've been on. Back in September 2023, the Victorian Government released the Victorian Housing Statement in response to the housing affordability and supply issues facing Victoria. This was based on the premise of build more homes and they'll be more affordable. The statement foreshadowed the planning reform agenda that we're working through at the moment with the State Government and outlined reforms coming in 4 key areas. So it was around identifying where housing is to be provided, streamlining pathways for certain types of development, removing red tape for development, and incentivising the provision of affordable housing. As a result of the housing statement, a housing target of 30,000 additional homes was set for Bayside by 2051. So this target is in addition to the roughly 44,000 homes currently in Bayside. A number of key projects have been announced in Bayside to assist in providing that housing. The first one of those projects is the Suburban Rail Loop, which many of you would have heard about. The Suburban Rail Loop is a city-shaping project which commences with the delivery of the south-east segment of a rail line between Cheltenham to Box Hill. While the station is located in Sir William Fryer Reserve in the city of Kingston, Bayside is included within the precinct structure planning boundary. This is proposing to rezone the area in the vicinity of the station for higher density development and proposes significant change in areas of Hyatt, Pennydale and the Bayside Business District. Significant changes of height have been proposed in this area and public hearings are currently underway on the project. The second big reform that Bayside is experiencing or has experienced with regards to the Activity Centres pilot program. This program was the pilot of the Activity Centres program, which focused on the first 10 activity centres. So the Moorabbin, or what we call in Bayside as Hampton East, Activity Centre was included as one of the first 10. This activity centre is split between us in Bayside, in Kingston and the Glen Ira Council areas. New planning controls came into effect on the activity centre on the 11th of April 2025, and this is the first time we'd seen a new suite of planning controls that have been prepared by the government to implement the Activity Centres program. These controls included the built form overlay, so this applied to land that was already zoned in the Activity Centres zone, and includes a range of outcomes and standards for building heights, setbacks, overshadowing and wind impacts. It's streamlined an assessment process for applications in the land covered by the built form overlay. That means that through a deemed to comply pathway, it will mean that if a proposal meets specific predetermined building height, street wall height and setback requirements, it'll automatically be deemed to be compliant with regulations and it cannot be refused a permit. It's also implemented the Housing Choice and Transport Zone, which has put in place controls to accommodate greater heights for catchments around the activity centres. And it also recognised for lots, what they call large lots, or those 1,000 square metres and above, taller heights can be incorporated. What this has meant for Moorabbin is the addition of greater heights within what was the previous activity centre boundary, but also what has been termed the walkable catchment zone. This includes 6 stories on the green colour here, which was previously a residential transition area, and then 4 to 6 stories in the dark blue and 3 to 4 stories in the lighter blue area. Bayside has yet to see any planning in relation to infrastructure planning in relation to the Moorabbin Activity Centre. We understand that state government is working on this, but they've not been yet able to tell us when this might occur and what infrastructure types will be included to support the new dwellings that will be constructed in this area. And then the third is what we're here to talk about today. In October 2024, the state government announced the next 50 activity centres it would commence planning. This included the North Brighton, Middle Brighton, Hampton and Sandringham activity centres on the Sandringham line in Bayside. And the program was also rebranded the Train and Tram Zone Activity Centre Plan. Initial consultation was undertaken back in May and June this year, asking high-level visioning questions to the community. More detailed plans were released on the 10th of September this year in a second phase of consultation, which provided more detail to the community in terms of the proposed heights and extent of changes to planning controls. To provide a high-level summary of what's been proposed to aid the conversation today, I'll start with North Brighton. So you can see on the right the current suite of planning controls for Bay Street and the North Brighton Activity Centre. What we've got currently is up to 4 stories where the dark orange is shown, up to 3 stories in the light orange, and up to 3 stories in the area surrounding the activity centre in the purple kind of colour. On the left, you can see what's proposed by the state government and is currently out for consultation. Up to 6 stories, with a small pocket of 12 stories in the core zone. So that's the light colour area in the middle. 4 to 6 stories in the inner catchment, which is that darker blue colour. And then 3 to 4 stories in the outer catchment, which is the lighter blue colour. Moving on to Middle Brighton. In the existing controls, you can see there's currently 3 to 4 stories along Church Street, with 4 being the darker orange and 3 being the lighter colour again, and up to 3 stories in the surrounding catchment. What's proposed is a varying level of height on Church Street. 12 stories where there's red, areas of 10, 8 and 6 stories along Church Street, the darker the orange colour, the higher the height, and an extensive area of inner catchment with up to 4 stories, with between 4 to 6 stories, and an outer catchment of 3 to 4 stories. On to Hampton. In the core, Hampton is currently 3 to 4 stories, with a small pocket shown in blue off Willis Lane as up to 6 stories. With the surrounding area up to 3 stories, there is an exception of the foreshore area, which is affected by design and development overlay, which restricts the height to 2 stories with the potential for an attic in some circumstances. Heights in Hampton have been nominated for 16, 12 and 8 stories. Also is being shown as a strategic site in the area behind Woolworths. It's our understanding that this relates to further work that needs to be done to plan the site, but no height limit has been allocated at this stage. And as with the other areas, there's substantial catchments of inner and outer catchment area, shown between 4 and 6 and 3 to 4 stories respectively. Of note is the inner catchment area, which extends to the foreshore, which represents a significant height different to the current controls there at the moment. And the final of the 4 new activity centres is Sandringham. The existing controls in Sandringham show areas of 3 to 4 stories in the orange colours and up to 5 stories in the hot pink and the dark green areas. The light green shows 2 stories plus attic controls in the areas approaching Beach Road and along the foreshore. The proposal from state government shows substantial areas of up to 12 stories, with the balance of the centre in 8 stories. And again, as with the other centres, there's substantial areas of inner and outer catchment areas. So when you have a look at it, we've got a consolidated plan on the left showing all 4 centres joined together. You can see the extent of the core areas, but also the consolidated effect of all the catchment areas on Bayside. We've done some maths, and approximately 50% of the Bayside municipality has been proposed to be rezoned when you take into consideration the Activity Centre program expansion, the original Activity Centre program in Moorabbin, as well as the suburban rail loop. In contrast, on the right, you can see Council's strategic planning framework that's currently in place at Bayside. This shows our current structure planning, providing planning controls for additional density in the core of an activity centre and an area of moderate residential growth around it. This is focused on a balanced approach to dwelling growth, maintaining the village character of our centres while still providing for zoning for dwelling growth for more dwellings. The Bayside approach, by our calculations, is still anticipated to allow Bayside to meet the dwelling targets, but without creating the large massive density which is proposed by the state government. While Council's not formally endorsed a position yet in relation to the drafts, and this will be done through our November Council meeting, in preparation for preparing our submission, we've got some key takeaways and concerns on the process and what's been proposed. The consultation on these draft proposals has been undertaken in a piecemeal fashion, with little information provided to assist the community in understanding what's proposed and how the state government have got to the proposed maps. The consultation has largely been done in the school holidays as well, where a lot of the community are away on holidays. There are substantial areas of what is called walkable catchment zones extending from the core areas. We don't know how those walkable catchment areas have been calculated and what the capacity of these areas will be if they're fully built out. The areas of walkable catchment extend beyond what we would consider walkable in distance, and they also cross major roads such as Nepean Highway, which serve as natural barriers to walkability. So we question whether they really are walkable catchments. Initial analysis by council officers indicates that should these extents be incorporated into the planning scheme, in combination with the SRL, the pilot project in Moorabbin, and natural redevelopment that occurs in the balance of the municipality, we will significantly be over-providing for housing to meet the housing targets. So we'd really like to understand from the state government what the calculations have gone into preparing these. The plans also don't provide any indication of what infrastructure, such as transport or drainage infrastructure, open space or community facilities, is needed to be provided to the needs of these increased communities. We consider this as essential to maintaining the livability of our communities in Bayside. And no information has been provided to the community about how heritage overlays, of which Bayside has many, will interact with the proposed height controls and how that will be managed. So my message to the community is I encourage you all to get involved in the Activity Centres program and provide your feedback to the state government. Submissions are currently open and they're due on the 19th of October. Council's formal submission will be considered by Council at the 18th of November Council meeting. If you've got any questions regarding the program, I encourage you to contact the Activity Centres team at the Department of Transport and Planning using the details that are on the screen at the moment, but we're also happy at Council to have a conversation as well. I'm going to hand back to Kaz now for the rest of the session. Thanks, Kaz.
Thanks, Kelly. It's a lot of information for people to take in, and I can see that lots of questions are flowing through the chat. Some of that will have been known information to the audience, and some of that might be new for you. So we've got some clarifying questions to come through. To our panel, thank you for joining us. Now is your time to shine. The first question that I have for you, before I hand to the questions that have come in through our Menti, is can you please introduce yourself and tell the audience a bit about your connection to this work and to the area? Michael, I'll ask you to kick off, if that's okay.
I'm Michael Buxton. I'm a planning professor at RMIT. I've been working in the area of activity centres and urban planning now for a long time, and just a few introductory comments following on from Kelly. I think the really important question arising from Kelly's excellent presentation is why would any government impose a solution to the provision of housing which was going to wreck most of the essential elements that make a municipality like Bayside livable, when the council is already doing an excellent job providing the level of housing that the government insists upon. The council is doing its job, as many other councils across Melbourne are doing as well. They're providing the housing that's needed. And yet the government is riding over the top of communities and councils and imposing a completely different solution on the need for housing that is not necessary and is going to destroy many of the elements that make Melbourne a livable place. Now, my question is, why would any government do this? It's not rational. It's a fixation that this government has with a solution that is not necessary. And the scale of this is extraordinary. Kelly mentioned 50% of Bayside will be pulled down eventually because of this crazy solution that the government has. This is quite, this is going to be repeated right across the middle ring suburbs in particular, with 30, 40 and 50% of many of these municipalities who also are doing the job. And in the past 15, 20 years have consistently provided the housing that is needed. So just to finish up on my initial comments, there are solutions to what the government has identified as a problem, and the solutions are being put in place every day by communities and councils, where councils adopt what we know as land use planning. It's identifying what you can build where, while retaining all the really important elements that make Melbourne such a livable a city. And alternatively, the government's position is allegedly to provide affordable housing. But this proposal that the government has nothing to do with affordable housing. Affordable housing is not being constructed in Melbourne, not because of the need to get rid of red tape and to take away the planning rules. Even the development industry says and admits that affordable housing isn't being provided in sufficient numbers because of the high cost of building. It has nothing to do with land use planning, and yet the government insists on inflicting this narrative on people that it's all the fault of citizens and it's all the fault of councils. And my final comment that really worries me about this process, it's not just the scale, turning Melbourne unnecessarily into a high-rise city right through the suburbs. It's not just the scale of this, it's the way this is being done. The government has imposed a series of amendments right across Melbourne and parts of Victoria without advertising. There's been no opportunity for communities to comment, and they've just imposed these new amendments which inflict these changes when people have had no rights to contribute to the framing of the solutions. And finally, the solutions they're providing, again, then go and take away people's right to be notified or to comment or appeal. So this is a fundamental attack on democratic decision-making that should be seen to be alien in an economy and a society that we call ourselves a liberal government. So treating people as the enemy is not the solution. And governments really have a right to have an obligation to respect people's rights. Democracy only means something when it's applied, and the government is failing the test.
Thanks, Michael, for that introduction. So, yeah, you've got some concerns about the overall and the consultation process itself, as well as the activity centres not necessarily solving the problem that they set out to. Nicola, can I get you to introduce yourself and welcome to the panel? Thanks for coming along.
No problems. Yes, sure can. Hi, I'm Nicola Smits. I'm the Managing Director of Niche Planning Studio. I spoke with Michael, Mike and Matthew at a panel. It was in summer, perhaps last year, but we spoke on the first release of the Activity Centre program, so the first 10 that came out. And as Kelly rightly talked about, we've had a new release of the latest Activity Centre tranche, or the latest Activity Centre program. So the reason that I'm here for all of those that are watching, so as a planning consultant, I get appointed by either apartment builders, mums and dads that own properties, land developers that create new suburbs out in the greenfields. And the council work that I do could be structure plans. So I could be doing sort of structure plans around activity centres, or I could be doing structure plans in country Victoria. So the type of work that I do as a town planning consultant is quite varied. The type of planning consultant that I do, and the reason I'm here, is I've got expertise in urban design and in strategic planning. The third area that consultant planners get involved in is statutory. So I'm really interested and involved in the bigger picture, which is why hopefully I can help share some knowledge and insights from my perspective on the activity centre program and what's been happening to date. Please don't ask me something about how high a wall is or it's overshadowing. I don't know that sort of space as particularly well. I'm sure there will be others around the room that might be able to. But yeah, for me, a lot of the work that's been done today, it's been really interesting to watch it come out of the federal discussion. So the initial discussion about, you know, we've got more people, we need to be providing housing. Just like Michael said, you know, there was a really strong focus on affordability when the federal government was first talking about it. That housing accord and those numbers that all the state governments were sort of prompted to provide was not a bad thing in my perspective. You know, state government had to start thinking holistically about growth of their cities. Each state government's dealt with it differently. The Victorian government said that they wanted 70% of the growth to occur in the established areas and 30% in our suburban areas, for want of a better description. So sort of outer suburbia. So if you think of things like Cranbourne or Officer down in the southeast, or even in Geelong, or up in Hume up towards Sunbury, etc. So that was, at that time, the state government knew that there was about 60% of housing that was being provided in greenfields, and they said, look, let's just sort of bring that back to 30% and let's encourage an increase of housing in the established areas where people can use trains, access parks, go to cafes, all that sort of stuff. So as a town planner, that's a good principle. But perhaps the way the state government's been going about it hasn't been particularly awesome. And I think my couple of high-level reflections about what I would have liked to have seen done a little bit better, that we can definitely talk about. And I wrote myself a couple of notes, but and Kelly's kind of brought them up. So one of them was there's been a real lack of transparency around the document releases. So as a consultant, as council, as community, we've all been really unaware about information that was coming out regarding planning reform. We didn't know what was coming, we didn't know when it was coming, and when it's been released, we've all sort of been on the back foot trying to figure out what the implications are. So it would have been great to have greater transparency. In some of the urban reform releases, they haven't done consultation. In some of them, they've done very targeted, high-level visioning type consultation that's then hard for all of us as community members to understand the implications. So it would have been better if maybe they'd done a little bit more comprehensive consultation. I live in Stonington and I live in an area around a train station. So I have exactly the same concerns as everyone else. I don't know what the implications are of a heritage overlay when it compares with the new zones. You know, there's a lot of uncertainties. So it would have been good if they'd sort of addressed some of those uncertainties when they first brought it up. I also used to work as a developer out in Botanic Ridge, so down in the southeast. And so I get involved with the Urban Development Institute a lot. And exactly as Michael said, you talk to developers and great developers, not so great developers, all of them will tell you that the cost of construction is what's really holding them back. So it doesn't matter if the land is zoned appropriately. I've got clients who we've got permits for that haven't actually been able to develop apartments on sites that have been permit approved. So maybe that's not always the right answer. And maybe my last one that I think is really important is understanding this infrastructure upgrades. So if you put a whole bunch of new people into an area, we all need improved sewer, improved water, telecommunications. We need schools, we need parks, all those things. And so there's been a real lack of information from the state government about what planning's been undertaken in regard to that with these new areas, these new activity centres. And so it's really hard for everyone to sort of be comfortable with any new proposals. That's my thoughts.
Thanks for sharing, Nicola. I can see that there's already questions coming through, particularly with regard to some of the themes you're talking about, including infrastructure provision and things like this. I'll just remind the audience now that if you have questions, please ask them using the Menti function. So there's a QR code that was displayed earlier, and there's a link with a URL, so you can send your questions through, and they'll come through to me, and I'll filter them through to the panel. Mike, could I get you to introduce yourself?
My name is Mike Scott, and I'm a resident of Bayside. I have 40 years experience as a council planner and also as a consultant doing plans for councils. That actually included around 15 years ago doing the structure plans for the Bayside activity centres that we're talking about tonight. My presence here tonight, I should be able to help clarify what the government is proposing in relation to specific locations in Bayside. I'm particularly critical of the process the government has been going through. The absence of really any meaningful consultation with the community, and also the politicisation of this area, particularly of Brighton, by the Premier. Planning is a serious issue. It affects people's livelihoods, property values, etc., etc. And to trivialise it in the way that has been happening, I think is a really damning thing. I am a member of Charter 29, as is Michael Buxton. There are 5 of us who produce reports that tell the government how it should do planning better. And our most recent report is called Reforming the Reforms, which is a report about what should be happening now to the things we're talking about tonight, as opposed to what the government is doing. And that report is available on our website, which is charter29.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. You're a little bit fuzzy towards the end there, so we'll make sure when I send questions to you, just nice and clear. I think we're not catching your microphone, sorry, entirely clearly. Matthew, I'll hand to you. Oh, we've got a little reminder on the screen. I'll go back to the reminder. I'm ready for that. So we can get the questions coming in, so they can be nice and collated here in the background. On the screen, there's the QR code, so scan that with your phone. You can ask questions there, or you can click the link, and that should work on your computer. Matthew, could I get you to introduce yourself, please?
Not a problem, and good evening, Kaz, and good evening to everyone online. Matthew Cripps, I'm the Chief Executive Officer here at Bayside City Council. I was appointed in June of this year, but for the roughly 7 years prior, I've been working here at Bayside City Council as the Director of Planning and Amenity. So my portfolio primarily dealt with the statutory planning, strategic planning area, of which I've worked in for approximately 25 years within the local government sector. I've been involved, I think, with the state government since it's first announced that Moorabbin, or Hampton East as we call it, was going to be included within the pilot program, and that probably provided us a very clear insight into the way the government was going to move forward with its approach to activity centre planning. It's very different to the work that council, or the way that council has undertaken it for about the 10 or 16 years prior, which has been one of a methodical approach to understanding the housing demands, the infrastructure needs, the open space requirements, the barriers and limitations on an area, and trying to balance not only residential but also the commercial opportunities. What we're finding at this point is the state government's approach is very much a housing-focused approach. There is no commentary of any real extent around the future rezoning of land for commercial activities, which would support the future, I guess, accommodation and residential population that would move into the location. It's fair to say that based on Bayside City Council's work, a lot of the core focus of the activity centres have almost been confirmed as being appropriate. We've done a lot of focus around our building heights within the core around the railway stations. Apart from a couple of stories being added here or there, the primary focus of what is the core has been reinforced by the state government work. It is the concern around the catchment areas primarily, which is moving away from what has been primarily 3-storey residential dwelling or 2-storey dwellings beyond that, which are now looking like they will be focused for 6-storey or up to 6-storey around the inner catchment area and 4-storey in the outer catchment area, which creates a whole lot of questions for council about the area's ability to support that from an infrastructure perspective, which the government has been silent on throughout this whole process. We're unaware of, as has been said a few times, and particularly by Nicola, around all of those core services, everything from drainage, which is stormwater. We've got things along the lines of sewer, power. We're experiencing some of these challenges already within the Hampton East area with high-rise developments being constructed, where we've got residents who can't access internet or losing TV signals purely because of the high-rise development and the intensity of development. So council has effectively seen an approach which has been to focus on housing and delivery of housing. We haven't seen any of the documentation to support the rationale for the reason why Melbourne needs to be the size of London by 2050. It's a statement that the government has put out and keeps, I guess, repeating. So we've now got a figure of 30,000 additional dwellings, which is a 70% increase on our existing housing stock targeted for the Bayside community between now and 2051. Bayside, prior to these changes coming into play, was already delivering housing, and the last report that was produced in The Age just recently showed that Bayside is one of the only metropolitan councils that's actually hitting its housing target. We delivered 1,500 dwellings within a year, which is effectively in line with the target. And we have also looked at our housing strategy to understand that the municipality itself has the capacity to deliver 30,000 dwellings without significant change in our planning controls. So there is a concern that at one hand we have a target being set, council already having a whole lot of planning levers that it's actually used through consultation and engagement with its community, and we're now being beset by the state government to have planning controls which have no justification or limited data to indicate the basis of the areas that are to be affected. Based on some very preliminary figures, and we are still working through these, so I say they are preliminary. We understand that within the activity areas as they stand at the moment, so the Bayside City Council adopted position, that North Brighton, Middle Brighton, Hampton, Sandringham and Moorabbin alone have the capacity, if they were developed at a roughly 30% uptake, around 10,000 dwellings. That's a third of the 30%, and it's only in those existing catchment areas and activity areas as are adopted within the planning controls today. What we're seeing with the proposal would allow for well over 30,000 dwellings to be accommodated within just those catchment areas. And so there is a challenge around the justification for the extent of some of those catchments and that are being proposed without having quality conversations with our community. And then there is a question mark on how they will be serviced and whether they can actually be delivered in an affordable manner for the community that potentially would move into this area. Council's been advocating quite strongly and will continue to advocate quite strongly on behalf of its community. Part of this session this evening is really to assist the community understand what's being proposed, but also to hear from you so that we can continue to advocate and make submissions to the government. And so more than happy to take questions from our community and try and provide a response where required. So thank you, Kaz.
Matthew, thanks for sharing. I can already see that there's themes coming up through all of our panelists that echo the questions that are coming through in the chat here. I have a question that's to kick us off for the whole panel or whoever might choose to take it. And I think there's already been a nod to this, but could you tell us a bit about the draft catchment boundaries? You know, the Plan for Victoria, the steering committee reports say that walkable catchment is 800 metres. This is something Kelly touched upon in the presentation, they're drafted to be up to 2.5 kilometres from a train station. What are your thoughts on that as a walkable, in terms of walkability as a catchment? Nicola, you're off.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
This is just for everyone that's watching. So Michael Buxton and Mike Scott are both amazing in this space. So we'll just let them jump in after I do it. But there was something that came about in the 90s when I was going through uni, and it was called New Urbanism Principles. And it was all about 400-metre walkable catchments to parks and 800-metre walkable catchments to activity centres and train stations. That was the premise upon which town planning started to talk about the creation of communities. So they figured that someone might be prepared to walk. In some cases, you might be prepared to walk further to go to a train station, perhaps, if it was at the where two 800 circles met. And so if you were going from the extreme end of 800 to the train station, you might be prepared to walk a bit further. But something up to 2 point, whatever that distance was that you said, Kaz, doesn't fit into the traditional metrics that we would normally see as part of a walkable catchment. I'm assuming Mike and Michael have something more to add to that about walkability.
I can add to that if you like. The idea was to have as many people as possible living near shops, services, and good quality public transport, and I think that's a principle all of us support. For many years, that has been measured arbitrarily as being from the central point of a shopping centre for a radius of 800 metres. And when I was involved in doing the plans for the Bayside Activity Centre 15 years ago, that's how we measured things. The way the government is measuring the 800 metres now appears to be from the edge of the commercial shopping centres of each centre. And that has resulted in massive swathes of the southeastern suburbs becoming designated as walkable catchments. And for example, the North Brighton and Middle Brighton catchments completely overlap. And indeed, the very core of those centres completely join. And in terms of the wider catchment beyond the 800 metres, North Brighton, Middle Brighton, Hampton and Sandringham conjoin completely. So in other words, it's just a huge swathe that continues from the north of Bayside down to just beyond Sandringham that is subject to these new changes, when in the old days we just measured 800 metres from the centre of the centre.
Michael, did you want to add to that?
I think the other problem with the government's approach is, as Nicola and Mike have said, the principle of having more people live around close to public transport is a generally accepted one internationally, but the two problems are the one that Mike mentioned, that there is so much land now to be rezoned for up to 6-storey, and under another planning amendment up to 8-storey sometimes in the suburbs, that if you look at the government's map of its 60 activity centres, and that's only the beginning, they're going to go over 100 and right down to the neighbourhood level when you look at their planning amendments. But if you just look at that 60, huge areas along the rail lines and some of the tram lines overlap. And so the big problem with that is that Melbourne, as a city, was located around train stations. We had a linear rail lines quite early, and so that means that much of our high amenity and heritage housing is located around these high quality public transport areas. And to just adopt one principle as the overriding one, no matter what else, no matter what other values are there, is completely unjustified. It is just this blanket approach to saying we've got to pull everything down that is within these activity centres over time, no matter what their value. And so what this broad brush approach the government's adopting is going to mean that most of our unique heritage, high amenity areas are going to be demolished. And that is going to have enormous impacts on the way people live in Melbourne. I mean, you know, amenity is so important economically, not just for our health and our well-being and the way we feel about ourselves in the city. It's important economically. And to just wreck it because of this one-size-fits-all approach that the government has just mandated and applied, it makes no sense. And everybody I speak to about this just shakes their head in horror, asking how can a government that represents the people be so crass in its approach to planning?
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, more impacts than just walkability in terms of the definition of the centres as part of this plan is what I'm hearing. We've got quite a lot of questions coming through, so I'll keep going through them. The next one is for you, Michael, and I think you've answered this loud and clear, but I will put it to you. Will affordable dwellings be built as a result of the new planning controls?
Well, not at the moment, and they don't look like being built because of this alliance between the federal government and the Victorian state government around this ideology that all you have to do is take away the rules. So the federal government now is allowing people to buy a house on allegedly targeting affordable housing purchase on a 5% deposit. Every single commentator who knows anything about this says that's going to worsen affordability and impose terrible long-term problems on people. So every lever that these governments is pulling is actually allegedly designed to help affordability, but is actually reducing affordability. And if we just look at the housing market, I mean, Nicola is right. She's been one of the people that have been involved in this actively, but every large builder that I speak to has the same story, that it's costing far more to build a so-called affordable housing dwellings, particularly in the form of apartments, because that's what's being constructed. Apartments are one of probably the highest cost form of development. And it's costing more to build each one of these than the builders can get back from sale. At least 100,000, and there have been some estimates of double that for relatively low-cost affordable housing. So it's not going to get any better. And so what's being built? What's being built? You can go along the arterial roads of Melbourne, you know, the high-value places in Armadale and so on, and parts of Bayside. And what's being built is 3-storey apartments, high-value, high-cost apartments for people like me who want to downsize. Not that I necessarily want to do that, but if I do, downsize into, and they're $2.5 to $3.5 million, right? Now, there's lots of them. So when the government says, oh, there's a drop in housing approvals this year, and that's true, it has dropped since COVID. It's stayed up a bit, but it's been generally around its long-term average, but it has dropped a bit. One of the main reasons is that developers are simply not putting in applications because it's not worth their while. Why would anyone? I mean, there are 45-storey buildings not being built, right, in Box Hill. Why would anyone spend all that money planning and designing buildings and put in your planning applications when you know you're not going to build them? So when governments mislead everyone by saying, oh, the approvals are down, of course they're down because developers are not applying in the same way, and what they're building is high-value apartments, but they're certainly not affordable.
Could I add one more point, Kaz, which is that to provide affordable housing, you need cheaper land. And there are very few, if no, cheaper land options in Bayside. And therefore, you need some sort of positive government intervention to get cheaper housing. And the government has missed an opportunity here because they could have said, OK, you can have one extra floor on your development as long as that extra floor is for affordable housing. But instead of that, they're proposing to upzone this huge swathe of land in Bayside without any strings attached. I mean, it's the similar kind of scenario to what's happened in Fisherman's Bend, where the whole of Fisherman's Bend was upzoned so that all the landowners pocketed a massive, unearned increase in land value, and we can't even afford to put a tram track in there. So it's an opportunity missed by the government in this instance.
Thanks, Mike. Nicola, I'll let you jump in there.
I was just going to add one extra little bit. So this year I had a gig as the head judge for Victorian UDAA. So I was judging projects across the state, and Bayside probably had 6 maybe in the best projects for the year from developers, and they were in the categories of mid-range townhouse type categories. And Bayside was quite lucky in the sense that developers can only just make it work if they can get, just like you said, Mike, land that's that they can purchase at a slightly cheaper amount. Doesn't happen in Bayside. So the alternative is they produce beautiful homes, and if they produce beautiful apartment homes, then they can sell it, like Michael said, to people that are downsizing. And so that exact example that both men have talked about is exactly the type of product that council has planned for. So things like 3-story, 4-story type, beautiful arches and Low Living did some gorgeous products. There were some great projects that I got to see this year that were in Bayside that developers have produced under council's current framework. And I think that's a testament to the work that council's done to date. And in the current environment, both boys are right. The cost of construction is so high that you can't do those things that you want to do as a developer, which might really speak to your company ethos, or it might speak to what your board's after, or, just your longevity in the industry, and you want to be able to, say, I built that amazing project. If you can't provide affordable housing or key worker housing or something in that space where you can, put your name to it, these developers are not going to build the sort of poor quality stuff, and they can't turn a profit, so they won't. So yeah.
So it's not just not affordable for homeowners, which was the original question that we've had gone on the journey of this conversation, but it's also not affordable for developers, designers, and folk who are delivering this. Matthew, we've got a question for you. What will be the biggest impact in Bayside of the new mid-rise code for 4 to 6 stories, and when will it take effect? Will it apply to the suburban rail loop structure plan zone as well as the 5 activity centres and elsewhere?
So my understanding is that the catchment area, which is often referred to the housing choice and transport zone, or the ham and cheese toasty, is an area which won't necessarily apply directly to the suburban rail loop area. So they will have separate controls and separate zoning, which will be delivered through that process. There may be some duplications, but at the moment we're still working through those controls. I think the biggest challenge, and we are already seeing it within our established areas, is with the intensification of development brings a whole lot of challenges, particularly during construction. So as we are seeing more and more dwellings and construction activity occurring, it has massive amenity implications for a period of time while those constructions are occurring within a community. Now, regardless of whether that's 2-story or 6-story or 10 stories, you're going to go through pain when there is development occurring, but it's because we are funneling development in this particular location that you will see more attention and most likely more of the development occurring in this location. So there is potential construction pain that will come from that. The other thing that will be a big challenge will be parking and the implications of parking within our municipality. Now, Bayside City Council already has large areas of residential parking, and that may end up being expanded. Our policy doesn't allow for apartments or townhouse developments to actually obtain a residential parking permit if they've been built after a certain date. So the concern is, where do all of these vehicles park? We understand the government's also looking at reducing parking requirements on developments, because you're building these developments around areas which are well serviced by public transport. And so there is going to be this potential conflict between people who generally are looking to live within our community. And most of the developments we've had in the past, we actually have a greater car parking being delivered because there is an interest to have more car parking than the minimum standards. But what we're finding is the government's moving to have a maximum car parking rate to push down the amount of supply of car parking, and this will push people to park on street, which potentially will create greater congestion within our area. The other challenge is that with all the planning controls that are being proposed, it's simplifying planning setbacks, simplifying design standards. And what we're concerned is that we're going to result in a lot more homogenous development, or we're dumbing down, shall we say, the urban design outcomes. We're seeing greater footprints and site cover, which will result in less opportunity for landscaping, buildings set closer to the streets. And then we've also got the implications of stormwater and runoff from such large areas of hard cover. So the proposition of intensification has all been around relying on existing infrastructure. That's if the infrastructure has the capacity to support that. But the problem we have is that we have aging infrastructure over 100 or getting towards 100 years of age, which needs replacement upgrade. And that's going to have some significant implications on our community and our ratepayers to be able to facilitate the delivery of infrastructure to support future property owners.
Makes sense. So lots of infrastructure requirements across all elements really of living. Mike, this one's for you. How do you prevent overshadowing and overlooking where existing dwellings are able to be surrounded by, high-rise multi-story, and how will new development be able? Maybe this is a kind of double barrel, but how will new development be able to appropriately respond to existing heritage overlays? Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Yeah. There's literally hundreds of new standards and controls that have come in as part of the packages that the government is introducing, and I haven't got my head around all the detail of the overshadowing and overlooking. It has to be obviously in the context that in plenty of areas where there are single-storey houses at the moment, there's a very real prospect of a 4-storey or even 6-storey block of apartments going next door. And in circumstances where the 4- and 6-storey apartment block won't need a planning permit in the conventional sense that we understand it. We understand the present system is that when a development needs a planning permit, usually it's possible for members of the public or neighbours to be informed about the development and to make submissions and ultimately to object to VCAT, the appeals tribunal, if they wish to. Part of the government's new system is a thing called deemed to comply. Now, the government says that these 4- and 6-storey developments will still need a planning permit, but the standards that those developments must meet are deemed to comply. And if the proposal is deemed to comply against all its standards, then there is no possibility of making a comment on that development. The only comment people are free to make, or will be free to make, is whether it meets those defined standards or not whether I consider, the amenity of my garden is going to be ruined, or they're going to be overlooking into my bathroom or whatever. So it's really a revolution in the way that the whole planning system will work. You mentioned also the question of heritage. The government has made a strong play of the fact that they're not going to get rid of any heritage overlay areas that currently exist. They can be individual protections of individual buildings or heritage areas, and they're all going to stay. So the government is saying we've got nothing to worry about in terms of heritage. We would beg to differ from that interpretation, because these new zones, as I call it, the ham, cheese and tomato zone, the housing choice and transport zone, will overlay any heritage overlay areas that already exist. And anyone who has worked for years in planning realises that zones are more important than overlays. I've been in appeal hearings where I was told that if the same zone applies in Port Campbell as into Brunswick Street, Fitzroy, then the same kind of building should go in both places, irrespective of the overlays. So we believe that heritage overlay areas should be withdrawn from the ham, cheese and tomato zone, not included in it.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for sharing. For Matthew, some developers will build cheap, low-quality apartments, and not all have the same kind of standards ethically. Are you concerned about the no rights of appeal, you know, if things are deemed to comply, and what that will, you know, will there be restrictive rules on councils to allow kind of lower quality apartments, I guess is the question there.
Yeah, it is going to be a challenge moving forward where things are deemed to comply. It's a metric-based assessment. Do you meet the setback? Do you meet the site cover? Are your windows screened appropriately or not? If you actually are able to meet those, they are not a matter that can really be considered as a grant of refusal. It's effectively allowed. So if you have a development, which could be low quality, that ticks all the boxes, we are required under the controls to advertise it. The community can raise a whole lot of issues, but ultimately council is not in a position to consider those issues if it's deemed to comply, and we are in a position where we have to support a potential application. We've also had some scenarios. So yes, we are really concerned around the quality, but we're also concerned that there is third-party rights of appeal being removed and stripped out of the planning controls, which has been the fundamental basis of the Planning and Environment Act 1987, which was held up for a long time as the best planning, I guess, control and legislation in Australia for years. So the fundamentals of the planning controls are looking to wind that right back and take away third-party rights, so neighbours' rights to appeal, potentially even council's ability to actually object or appeal around applications. The other thing which we're finding in some of the Moorabbin controls, and and I need to unpack them a little bit further, is the fact that if you are proposing a development which doesn't meet a particular minimum standard, councils may be required to refuse applications for underdevelopment. So that might mean that if you're not meeting at least 50% of the heights or 50%, that there is a provision that seeks for councils to ensure that the development of this land is achieving certain outcomes. And so there's this potential challenge that might stymie development further, where people can either build a dwelling as of right, a single dwelling, but if they are required to build a 4-storey apartment under controls, but they're only proposing a number of townhouses or units, which may only be 2 stories or single story, there may be the challenge around whether they can actually be approved. So there are challenges that the government are trying to build in, which is really to force development, but may actually find that people aren't in a position to actually afford to develop, or it's going to actually push more substandard quality to enable the development to occur.
Wow. That was amazing, because I haven't heard about that, and that just is so concerning. So from a development perspective, when you're looking at, by the way, I support everything that he just said, because from a development perspective, when you were looking at new zoned areas, often we would work with the state government as developers in my previous role, and the government would say, oh, you know, we want 8-storey apartments out in Cranbourne. And you would say to them, well, hold on a minute, people, it's nowhere near a train station. It doesn't have any amenity. How about we just look at the premise of this is a good area for people to live. Let's put in the urban design framework so the roads are in a good location, as they obviously are in Bayside, that we've got parks located where they should be, as they are in Bayside, and then let's let the market decide what is the appropriate sort of what do people want to live in that area, what's working right now. So we would then enable density to sort of be slightly more than perhaps standard, and people would get used to townhomes, and then once they got used to townhomes and you had these maybe rear lanes in, and you had you know, infrastructure in place, then the next iteration, someone would come along and go, oh, actually, now I can put a 4-storey apartment building in this bit, and it evolves and grows over time. And that's how that's how places change. That's why when you go to places like Paris and Vienna and et cetera, they've grown and evolved over time. Someone didn't just come along on day one and go, yep, we're just going to have a, what is it, Michael, 4-story, 6-story height limit in these places. And then it just looked beautiful. It's a growth and an evolution of a city. And I think that would be the concern with, you know, someone thinking that this is a great product and we've tested the market and we think this is something that's not provided in the area that people would like to live in. And then poor council has to say, actually, it's, you know, under development. So we're really sorry about that. But anyway.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Nicola. It's a, yeah, good insight. We've heard a lot about some of the concerns around this, and this is for Michael and Mike. And Michael, I think I'll throw to you first. As independent speakers to council, what do you think council can actually do in response to some of the concerns being raised? Apart from providing a submission, what's your advice to local governments in how they should respond to these planning reforms being undertaken? And what's your advice to residents? So twofold, what's your advice to council and then to residents?
I think local government is extraordinarily important in this struggle. But firstly, councils have to see it as a struggle. The government wants councils to play the game that they are dictating. They want councils to make submissions, to be polite, and to respond through the channels that the government sets up. And when we look back in the past at some of the big campaigns that local government in this state have run, they've been extraordinarily successful often, where they're banded together. You know, the one I use for the Bayside councils as the example was the Westgate Bridge, when hundreds of thousands of cars were going to pour into all the Bayside suburbs from Port Melbourne down to Bayside, and the councils got together and they convinced the government to widen the whole of Nepean Highway from Elstonwick to Moorabbin and to close off all those streets. And that only happened through joint council action, activism. They played a hard political game in a combined way. They got together and they agitated and they developed a campaign. And the second thing that they can do is what Bayside is doing through this kind of function tonight, to inform their communities. But I think communities have to be mobilised. Information is incredibly important, but mobilisation has to happen from there on. And if communities just say that they can't do anything about this and just accept it but grumble, then it's going to happen. It'll happen incrementally. It won't happen overnight, but it will happen. So the two things that can be done is for councils to get together with each other, find allies, and this is terribly important for the councillors, and for communities to mobilise, as they are. I mean, there are now over 40 groups have formed to oppose these developments, and some of them have 700 people on their contact list. So there is reaction, and there is political action. The opposition is running for them. So there is an underlying activity movement happening, but it has to be all joined, and this is where local government can come in. Local government has to work together with other councils and their communities to get a campaign going, and if a campaign happens, then it will have an impact. And the community and the government and the local government have to work out what they want. As Mike said before, there are small and big changes that can be made. One of the changes that should be made overnight is what the Heritage Standing Committee recommended in several instances, that any area zoned with a heritage overlay or even a neighbourhood character overlay should not be zoned with the housing choice and transport zone and the built form overlay, right? Now that New South Wales have brought in similar kind of legislation, nowhere near as draconian, but they've exempted lots of heritage and environmental areas, and that's one thing that can be done. But ultimately, these provisions have to be repealed, and we have to go back to what Bayside are doing and other councils are doing, and go back to a much more sophisticated way to meet housing needs. And of course, this can be done. So they're our challenges.
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, pretty clearly, council can join together with other councils, inform the community, and community can mobilise. I feel like there's a really good analogy coming together about the ham and the cheese, and council's the cheese. I'll get to it by the end of this. We'll
a couple
of
other thoughts, if I may,
Mike. Yeah, I was going to throw to you now.
Michael and I have been impressed by how local heritage groups have been banding together across Melbourne and finding common ground, and we think that effort will ultimately win them some points. There's always a difficulty of local community groups forming a unified position, because each group will feel that its local area is unique, or that its issues are distinctive to that area. And one of the reasons we wrote our report, Charter 29 report, called Reforming the Reforms, was to try and find, or try and suggest, some common ground between the community groups. And one last thing is that we've been amazed and astonished how powerful the so-called YIMBYs have become in this debate. I mean, the YIMBYs are not a large group, but they seem to have the ear of the media, the politicians, and for some reason they're getting all the headlines, whereas when a group like ours does professional, well thought out work, we're having real trouble getting it to be listened to and read.
Sharing, Mike. So we're at about 7:10. We've got about 20 minutes left together with this audience. So I've still got quite a lot of questions to come through. So your summarised versions from here on into the panel. But that's not to say that the depth that's coming through hasn't been absolutely spot on. This is to the group. The state's in quite a lot of debt. Where's the money going to come from to pay for this, and why is it a priority to build when the infrastructure for the current population is already stretched? You were saying earlier, Matthew, that you've got ageing infrastructure in Bayside. Has anyone considered the issues of older citizens and being able to access public transport, and particularly for older people or people with limited mobility, questions about parking and the appropriateness of public transport? So I guess this is a question about infrastructure, and who's going to foot the bill for that, and then also about mobility and access and the appropriateness of that for everybody.
So if you'd like, Kaz, I can, I'm happy to lead off. So I think the way the government has been talking about infrastructure, which is yet to be released, is through developer contribution. So there is a proposition that as each dwelling gets constructed, the developer, or through the purchase, the developer will actually make a contribution of X dollars, still to be defined. There are some concerns about where that funding will go. Will that go back to state government? Will it come to local council? Because as indicated, there is a bit of a gap in terms of state government funding. And obviously there is a bit of a concern around, are they going to use that funding for state government related infrastructure that's needed to be delivered within these areas or other areas? So ultimately the purchaser of the property will be, burdened with that cost, but that also creates this problem of buildings no longer being or becoming less affordable because you're placing more of those costs on future dwellings. The second element is probably council will need to look at how it funds some of the infrastructure through its own rate base. So we would need to look at our capital works program and look at how we deliver those parts of infrastructure that we can afford to deliver, but in a council environment, which is in a rate capped state government environment, councils are limited to how much additional, money it has. And it needs to balance that through all of the services it provides for the whole of the community. So it's not just about new infrastructure or improving existing infrastructure for intense construction, but it's about how do we deliver open space, pavilions, maternal child health services, and so on across the whole of the municipality. So that's another challenge that council has to navigate. I think the last thing which has been interesting is the state government has made a comment around the fact that they've identified the activity areas to leverage off the expenditure it's placed in public infrastructure, particularly around the rail separation projects. Important to note that the Sandringham line has not been subject to any investment from the suburban rail, the level crossing removal program. And so in terms of accessibility, in terms of community being able to access those facilities, they've not been upgraded. So they're the original railway stations. We've got infrastructure which we need to look at from footpaths and the like throughout our municipality, which would need to be either upgraded or maintained at a certain standard to ensure that it's available for older community and people who may be disabled. So there are a lot of challenges. The other thing is the Sandringham line is not connected to the future suburban rail loop, which will provide access out to Box Hill from Cheltenham. We are effectively still requiring our community who might use fixed rail to go into Melbourne to be able to access the rest of Melbourne via rail. Because bus services are a little bit more difficult, but that needs to be looked at more holistically about how the integration of transport works from not just rail, but buses and the like. There's options and solutions, but these are all issues that need to be addressed.
Thanks, Matthew. Nicola, I'll let you jump in there.
Thank you. I just thought I'd put my Greenfields hat on for a second because I thought it was useful to maybe, hopefully quickly, Kaz, explain the background to the infrastructure contributions process that is likely to occur with these structure plans. So across both Metro Melbourne and outer suburban and regional councils have been used to developer contributions, usually through an overlay, through particular projects. In the Greenfields, the way that it worked was because new suburbs were being created with increased large numbers of new people living in an area that was maybe previously a farm, the state government body, which at the time was called the VPA would do a structure plan, would figure out the number of people, would figure out within the confines of that new suburb area what the infrastructure was that was required for those new people. So you can think about that with a new suburb. It was, you know, just like we were saying before, schools, recreation, new major roads, new telecoms, major infrastructure items, etc., pavilions. They would identify all of those in a list, and then that list would then be costed up. That cost would then be apportioned across the land holdings. And so when a developer would buy a parcel of land in the Greenfields, they would know how much money was going to have to be charged for the benefit of creating these new areas. So they would put that into their development feasibility, and then that was part of their overall cost when they looked at buying the land. When that same group, the VPA, has been rebadged to be working on the activity centre program, which is kind of what's happened within state government, they've then gone, oh, there was this great process that we used in the Greenfields. We'll use it in and around activity centres. So they've come up with the structure plans, and you would then expect in the same way that they would define the boundaries as they have, and at the same time that they would define the boundaries, they would then also define the new homes and dwellings and people that were coming into those areas, the facilities that they required, mental health, community facilities, rec, all of the different ones that we've talked about. They'd put costings to that, and then that would be part of the discussion about the structure plan and whether the appropriate facilities were being provided. There is a major failing right now that we have got these boundaries, but we have absolutely no understanding about, one, what is the cost of this infrastructure? Two, is the appropriate infrastructure being provided? Three, where is it being provided? Are they just going to acquire land? And so there is a lot of uncertainty right now. So Matthew is completely on the money about the process that council will need to go through, but you would expect that in a new area that's being developed and developers are buying land to provide homes for people, that there should be some infrastructure contribution charge that they should know ahead of time. So when they buy the land, they can cost it up so they can make it viable. And it's just not there right now. That's the problem.
Yep. Thanks, Nicola. This question's from someone who lives in a street with restrictive covenants on its titles. They're private legal rights that run with the title to the land and can only be varied by consent of the landowner. Can these be overridden, and how do they relate to the activity centres? feels like a pretty planning question. I'm not sure who the best respondent might be.
So I might
That's you,
give it a
Matthew.
bit of a go. So at the so going back, I think it was in around 99 2000, there was a legal case that I guess transformed the way that covenants are dealt with within Victoria. Back then, covenants weren't considered as part of the planning process, and a group of residents from Banyule City Council appealed against the decision of a developer to build 3 dwellings on a site which had a single dwelling covenant. As a result, the legislation was changed so that under the Planning and Environment Act and through planning processes, covenants must be considered, and you must not be in breach of a covenant when a planning application is lodged. This process cannot remove the statutory and legal right and position of a covenant on the title in terms of bringing in new zones and when planning applications come through. However, having said that, there are ways of covenants being removed through planning scheme amendments, through applications of the Supreme Court or individual planning applications. Now, the Minister has the complete power to manage planning scheme amendments, which we're seeing through the potential for the introduction of these controls. Now, I'm not saying that the Planning Minister would actually use that in relation to covenants. I'm just saying that's one of the levers the government has to remove them. My expectation, though, is that covenants will remain, and if you have a single dwelling covenant, that overrides the ability under the current planning framework to be able to allow for something else to occur on the site.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Matthew. That makes sense to me. We've got about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to give our panelists a bit of a tricky prompt. I'm hoping that we'll have time at the end to reshare the screen so people understand how they can participate in the state government process, and we'll do some formal wrap-ups. So I want to just throw to each of you one last time, though, for a bit of a 1-minute kind of wrap on your final words. The prompt, you take it or leave it, could be, are these planning changes necessary, and are there better alternatives? I'll let you pick who goes first. Nicola, you look like you want to have a think about it.
I can jump in
ready?
if you like.
Great.
Something I haven't covered so far. A couple of things. The ham, cheese and tomato zone number 1, which is the 800 metres around each centre. I've had a detailed look at the one near where I live in Middle Brighton to see roughly how many sites there are where a 6-storey building, a 6-storey apartment could be built with just a deemed to comply permit. And it's quite a large number. But when you dig more deeply, the larger sites have actually mostly been recently redeveloped for apartments. The ones that are left are churches, a historic hotel, the croquet club, and some heritage homes that don't happen to be covered by heritage areas. And I think that just illustrates the rather slapdash way in which this work has been done and imposed on the community, that if a proper local plan had been done, those bits of information would have been revealed and the proposed controls changed accordingly. And just lastly, looking at the actual core of each activity centre, where the shopping centres are, we haven't really talked about in detail about the proposed height limits there. And I mean, looking at Middle Brighton, for example, the current controls are roughly 3 or 4 stories along the strip of Church Street. And the proposed changes are to 6 stories, but mostly 8 stories, and in some cases 12 stories. And there's no information about how those increases in height have been arrived at or justified. When you go to Hampton, the proposed heights are up to 16 stories. There are already some very high buildings along the railway line at Hampton Station. They are 4 to 7 stories. For some reason, they're now shown as 16 stories. And again, with no explanation. And you go to the state government's own publicity material about what's happening in Brighton, and you go to perhaps the North Brighton information page. What were the concerns raised by the community in the previous consultation? Concerns that apartment developments will ruin local character, They want more local businesses in Bay Street. They're worried about traffic congestion. And what does the government say they're going to do? Along Bay Street, new buildings will respect and enhance the area's heritage character, keeping a sense of openness and charm. And yet, what they're actually talking about is changing from 1 and 2 story to 6 stories. I just can't believe the unprofessionalism of this work.
Thanks, Mike. Nicola, I'll let you.
Thank you. I was thinking planning's about collaboration, it always has been. And so collaboration regarding planning reform should really be that the state government should be working with the local government, should be working with the local community. And there's always a discussion about who does structure plans best. And I think if you take it out of Bayside and you look at lots of different councils, yeah, sure, there's probably some councils that aren't doing particularly a lot of forward thinking with strategic planning, but Bayside has clearly done a lot of their work. And so I think I was just reflecting on what your question was, and I think regarding Bayside, a better way to have done it would have been the state government figured out what the yield was that they were chasing. They engaged with the local council to discuss what their current extents were. They maybe raised query with some of them and asked them to push it a bit. But realistically, the way that I see it from a consultant point of view is that there are a lot of people that have been repurposed from working in greenfield rollouts to working in apartment areas that don't understand the complexities of planning for density around train stations. And they've used a very similar broad brush for everyone. And I feel like they really lost an opportunity to work with Bayside and really understand the local community and create precincts that could have been uniquely different, could have had different, characters, could have had council really in their corner and advocating with them for Bayside to be a great example of, providing this housing supply. So I think there's been an opportunity lost, which is an unfortunate situation.
Thanks, Nicola. Michael?
The government has sold us a narrative that we have to have this imposed upon us for our own good because councils and communities haven't been supplying enough housing. But if we look at the figures from 2005 until now, over 200,000 multi-unit approvals have resulted in multi-unit dwellings in the metropolitan area of Melbourne, the middle ring suburbs mainly, and some in the established outer suburbs, and that's double the number of units that have gone up in the central city area in all that high rise we see. So there's been an enormous contribution by councils and communities using the process that Nicola just explained, a collaborative process under a series of rules, under zones, where councils, working often with consultants and their communities, work out what can be built where while retaining the valued elements that we define as livability. Now, we know that councils, that the government doesn't have to do this, but they are doing it, and unfortunately we have to figure out what to do about it.
Sorry, Michael, I have to interrupt. Our webinar might actually time out right on 7:30. So I've just been notified of that. Matthew, I won't take final remarks from you if that's okay, but I will wrap, and then we can perhaps at the end, if there's a little bit more time, I'll just make sure that we get up on screen the information so people have the closeout and know how they can participate in the state government process. Sorry, Michael. No. I just don't want to be cut off before people can realise how to make a submission. So consultation with the state government is open until the 19th of October. You can write a submission, activity.centres@transport.vic.gov.au. You can call the team, there's a hotline, and you can do a survey on Engage Vic. You can also write to the Minister for Planning. And as Kelly said during the presentation, you can also get in touch with council to talk about the council process. And Bayside team will follow up by posting a recording of this session, and council's preparing a submission that will be presented on the 18th of November at the council meeting. now that I've got a minute left after I've got that info out, I do want to thank all of the panel members for your insights, for your detailed information, for your in-depth knowledge about a really complex topic. I feel like I went back to planning school and it was good. It was as good as the first time around. So really useful, really digestible information for community members to be able to understand far better what's happening in the neighbourhood and the ways that they might have a say. You know, it's been put really succinctly for community. Your advice, Michael, is to kind of mobilise and band together. And I think, you know, a lot of the feedback is from the team, and we've got comments coming through the chat. Is thanks so much for providing this opportunity and all of this information. And also thank you to the Bayside team in the background who have been typing up questions from community and sending them to me this whole time. Thanks for your time and for putting this on. And to over 200 community members who came onto this call, thank you so much for your time and for your interest and for making these nights possible. Matthew, did you want to, I cut you off there. Did you just want to have one closing remark?
I'd just like to say thank you very much for hosting this evening. I think from Bayside's perspective, we've been identified by the state government as blockers. That's not necessarily the case because we're seeing a large amount of development that has been delivered and a lot of wonderful planning, which has been the focus of this council for over 20 years, with activity centres being the primary basis of delivering quality housing and commercial centre outcomes for those that want to live in Bayside. I think you asked the question around are planning changes required? Absolutely. We always need to look at how we go about doing planning and opportunities for increasing housing. But I think the way the government has gone about it could not be more succinctly put than the people that spoke before me. It's been there's been some concerns around the process. It hasn't been a complete structured planned approach. It's been a focus on delivering housing outcomes in a time frame which has been set by the Minister for Planning, which I think has some kind of alignment with other things occurring next year, opposed to getting the best and right outcome for our community. And so it's a challenge that we all have to deal with, and mobilisation from everyone within our community is going to help support Bayside make sure its concerns are put forward and tabled.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And if you're a person who had a question that went in and didn't get answered, there'll be a written follow-up for you there. There were some that we just didn't quite get to. Thanks everyone so much. I'll say goodbye. This is the end.